Welcome to Mind, America's Lignite Energy Podcast, brought to you by the Lignite Energy Council of North Dakota. Here's your hosts, Kate Muggerud and Jeff Simon.
All right, good morning, everybody. Hello. Thank you for joining us again. Or I guess good afternoon, good evening, depending on when you're listening to it. But thanks for joining Mind, Lignite Energy in America. We are so proud to be working on season 3, kicking off this season. We have McLennan. Mac is the CEO of Minnkota Power. Mac, thanks for joining us. Awesome to have you.
Thanks, Kate. I appreciate it.
Fantastic. And my wonderful co-host, Jeff Simon. Jeff, how are you?
I'm doing well. Wearing a suit because we're in the legislative session now, but standing out here somehow virtually on Highway 85, just south of Medora, you know.
Yeah, looks great. Looks beautiful. No snow. I'll take it. Mac, thanks so much for joining us here on the podcast. It's great to have you. We visited before with a couple of the people you work with, the good people you work with, and we're glad to have you here so we can kind of pick your brain a little bit. But tell our listeners, first of all, kind of what your job is, what that means, what Minnkota is all about.
Sure. So Minnkota is a electric cooperative made up of distribution cooperatives. We basically serve electricity on the east side of North Dakota, the west side of Minnesota. So about half of our electricity goes to Minnesota, half stays here in North Dakota. We are, essentially made up of 11 distribution cooperatives and then have an affiliation with 12 small cities here on the east side of the state, North Dakota, and then western Minnesota. So our job fundamentally is to figure out how to produce power, which mostly happens in a couple of coal shafts on the west side of North Dakota. So out of 3 coal plants or 3 coal shafts at 2 sites, and then a substantial amount as well of wind that we buy all here in North Dakota as well. So we have 6 wind contracts, and then we're also the beneficiaries of a little bit of electricity that comes out of the Garrison Dam on the Missouri River. So we try to put that portfolio of electricity on the west side of North Dakota and get it transferred to the east side of North Dakota and western Minnesota. And then try to keep that running in the coldest days of the year, I guess, is the biggest goal for us generally. So mostly we just produce and transmit power, and then people take it from there and deliver it to people's homes. So that's the easiest way to describe what we do anyway.
Yeah. So just quickly, your customer area, what would you consider what the area that you serve there again?
Yeah, so most people would recognize it's fundamentally from Devil's Lake, North Dakota, or just west of Devil's Lake, North Dakota, over to International Falls, Minnesota, and then down to the, say, just south of the I-94 corridor. So roughly that area from, say, Fargo to the border, and then from International Falls over to Devil's Lake, if in that kind of rough territory. So mostly agricultural based. It's the Red River Valley. We don't serve Fargo and Grand Forks proper, but we serve all of the areas around both of those. So generally everything else inside that footprint is served by one of our members or by one of those small cities. So about 100, we'll call it 150,000 consumers, kind of plus or minus. And then we own about 3,300 miles of transmission in that service territory to get it delivered.
So Mac, a significant portion of your generation portfolio obviously is coal. And the thing we really want to talk about mostly in this interview is Project Tundra. Tell us how it's advanced over the years, where you're at.
Right. So Project Tundra, project to fundamentally get carbon dioxide out of our largest unit at the Young Station. Started about 5 years ago. It was predicated on the idea of a project in Texas called Petronova, and originally started with the assumption that we would take compressed CO2, use it for enhanced oil recovery, fundamentally figure out how to make the Bakken fields more, the older fields, not necessarily the fracked fields, but the older fields in North Dakota, more productive. So, from a science perspective, CO2 works extremely well to help it literally lubricate more oil and gas to come out of the ground in traditional. And so the theory was that we have a lot of historical oil and gas development that could use an uplift that CO2 would provide. And so about 5 years ago, we used Petronova as an example of that. Now, mind you, oil prices were substantially higher during that time frame, so the economics looked substantially better. In the meantime, what happened was Congress passed a provision called 45Q, or a tax credit, which would allow you to actually get tax benefits to store CO2 on a permanent basis as well, and or for enhanced oil recovery as well. But I mean, on a permanent basis. And so as the oil prices dropped and as the interest in Western North Dakota was more along how do we continue to protect what we have and not make a lot of infrastructure investments in EOR, which I still think is on the horizon as we look forward and find ways to be able to produce better. But so we switched our focus from an EOR play to permanent storage of CO2 under the ground. And so Tundra evolved. You know, it started as an EOR project. It's now a permanent storage project as a result of what happened with 45Q. But the theory is fundamentally, you have this huge volume of CO2 going into the atmosphere. We fundamentally believed in some fashion or other we're going to live in a carbon managed world, and everyone can decide what that means of their own accord. But in our case, it just means there's either going to be a regulation on or a price to CO2 that we're going to have to figure out how to manage. And so we've spent then the last 5 years looking at the geology in North Dakota, looking at the economics of what it looks like to put a project like this in place. What's the technology do? What are the hurdles you have to get over? And so we have now advanced to the point that sometime in 2021, we'll have finished the engineering design. So the last kind of elements of what does the engineering look like. We have drilled 2 wells within 5 miles of the facility to look at, can you permanently store this safely? And we can talk a little bit more about what that looks like. But so we are, I would say, months away from trying to figure out the technical side of it. You know, can you make the engineer work and can you stick it in the ground? I think the bigger challenge is how do you ultimately end up paying for it, right? And that's one of the you're talking about $1 billion+ project on a utility who, in the greater scheme of things, is pretty small, right? So there's no way we can take $1 billion onto our balance sheet to build it. So part of it is now figuring out how do you get somebody to monetize the tax credits and make it work.
Yeah, 45Q has got to be a big part of that. If you're going to be geologic storage, the value of that is $50 a ton, which is really pretty substantial. But as you say, as a cooperative, you've got to find a partner, right?
Right. Yeah, I can't, even if I wanted to, use 45Q because I'm a not-for-profit, so I don't generate, it's not that I don't generate revenue, but I don't generate margins. So I don't have any tax. There's no way for me to use the tax benefits of 45Q. So you're right, Jeff. We have to find partners.
So what does that look like when you say you look for partners? I mean, how do you source that? Like, how do you strategically look for those partners? What would make a good partner for this program?
Right. So fundamentally, if you think about it in 3 pieces. So there's a tax equity partner, someone who can actually, as Jeff indicated, our goal is somewhere short or near 4 million tons of CO2 per year.
Okay.
So I'll call it 4 because I can do the math on the top of my head, right? So if you have 4 million tons a year at $50 a ton, you're producing a $200 million tax benefit. So you have to go find people who have substantial tax appetite to be able to monetize that. So you got the tax equity side. So those are going to be, frankly, large businesses who are trying to figure out how do I make an investment to offset my tax burden. Not unlike, so it is not novel. This is what most of the wind farms in this country are built on, this model, right? Which is you have a tax credit that somebody's monetizing in addition to producing electricity. So you go find individuals who have a tax appetite. That's one part of the solution. You need to find as well someone who's willing to do the debt financing of the project. So on the initial upfront, to be able to get it going to produce the tax credit that the tax equity guys will take, you fundamentally have to have somebody who will put up the debt during the construction period. And then you have to have sponsor equity. So there has to be, think about it in terms of your own home. The bank doesn't lend you 100% on your house. So you always have somewhere between a 5 and a 20% down payment, depending on where you are in the world. And so there has to be a sponsor equity side of this as well. And so you got those three components. So the sponsor equity side will partially come from us as the sponsor of the project. In addition, we'll need to find likely another sponsor equity participant as well. And then the debt side of it will be during the construction period. So you'll have somebody who's willing to put up the money for the construction period portion of it. And then you'll end up ultimately, once you start producing the tax credit, the tax equity guys will pay for all the operations on an annual basis, including the debt cycle side of it as well. So the $50 a ton is enough right now to basically pay your annual operating expenses in addition to whatever your debt cycle might be for that 12-year tax credit period. So
at the risk of throwing a little too much common sense into the equation, I mean, there got to be other wholesale cooperatives around the state or around the country that are maybe looking at something like this, or could be. Wouldn't it be simpler to maybe fix 45 Qs to make this a little easier?
Yeah, it would be. And Congress is actually working on that today, the concept of direct payment, and there's some other things that are being done, but that gets complicated as well. And Congress starts to get nervous with this idea we're going to give a tax credit to people who don't generate taxes. But you're right, Jeff. There are other ways to go about doing it that would make it less complicated, but a much bigger lift from a congressional perspective and IRS perspective. So that there is an effort to try to make it less complicated to be able to do that. There's also programs as well to help. So we're working with what's called the Loan Program Office at DOE. So they have a substantial number of dollars available to them as well for these kinds of projects. Mm-hmm. So they fundamentally can take on the debt side of it. So, or at least have a loan available, which would allow you to take on the debt side. And then and they also have what's called a guarantee. So if the technology itself doesn't produce at the level that it was advanced from a technological perspective, DOE has a program which would allow them to help then pick up the differentials. So there are some other mechanisms that we're currently working on to kind of help with the risk mitigation part of it. I'd say the biggest challenge to a project like this, because it's really first of kind to use 45Q in this fashion. There are no other projects out there in the US that use this. So we're kind of at the front of that and the cutting edge of it. Mm-hmm. The challenge is when you start talking to the bankers, or you start talking to people who might finance or tax equity individuals or other individuals, is that because there's not a pattern for it. No one knows that insert, here and this comes out here and it's all going to work, and it's been demonstrated tons of times, and it is that everyone then wants to either risk mitigate or insure or have a higher return, and when you do that, 45Q is just not quite enough for everybody to risk mitigate everything that might happen in a first kind project. Mm-hmm. So you have to figure out how to get somebody to help you mitigate some of that, whether that's guarantees on the technology or it's low interest loans that the state might provide to somebody to help finance part of it or participate in it, that helps kind of give it a little bit of a boost.
We need to talk a little bit, probably, Mac, about the new administration and the new Congress. There is certainly anti-fossil fuel sentiment in Washington these days, but I think it's important we need to add a little realism to the conversation that we do need baseload generation in this country. We cannot run the country on renewables. How are you and the trade associations with which you work communicating that message right now?
Yeah, so Jeff, you're right. I mean, that is one of the things that we are trying to work with the new administration on specifically. And to date, they have indicated they recognize that CCUS, carbon capture, utilization, and storage is a key part of being able to make all of this work. So, and you ultimately have them, at least today, saying, we understand this. We're going to continue to support ways to find technological innovation. But at the same time, which is a little bit of inconsistency, they say we're going to decarbonize the electric sector by 2030 or 2035. And so it's a little bit hard to figure out if on one hand you're saying we need to use technologies that allow that to happen, and on the other side we're going to drive towards basically taking carbon out of play completely, meaning we're going to all batteries or storage or renewables or solar or whatever that combination might be. It's a little hard right now to get your hands around what part of the administration or what portion of the administration will really win out in the debate over whether fossil fuels stay in the mix in their thought process. So, but you're right. I mean, basic physics in the utility industry at some point, and particularly where we live, you're gonna have to have something that turns on when it's 30 degrees below zero. And we've not yet been able to demonstrate that in wind. And so I think that's one thing that people don't necessarily understand. And I think we are so we have about 40% of our capacity or the ability to generate electricity is in wind today, right? So we are already substantially, as a utility, a long ways away. And I'll show you the graph about what happens when it gets to 20 degrees below zero. In 2019, when we had the last polar vortex, we have 467 megawatts of wind. We had not 1 megawatt of wind generating during that cold spell, right? So the only way that we were able to contribute our part to it was all of our coal units ran at 100%. And we have the ability to turn off about a third of our load in the winter on short spurts. So for several hours, we cycled people off of electricity to be able to meet our obligations, right? And it's designed that way. We give people a credit to sign up for it, and you hopefully don't have to use it a ton, but you do have to use it on occasion, right? And so your point's valid. I mean, somewhere there is a set of electricity from the physics perspective that has to be able to turn on and run all the time, or the system doesn't. And as much as people in North Dakota and the upper Midwest believe the wind blows all the time, right? It doesn't, right? I mean, we have some of the best wind farms in the country, and our best wind farm is 48% of the time, right? And generally it's spring and fall when your load is not. Or in winter, we get quite a bit of wind in winter too, but you're right, Jeff. I mean, we have to get people to understand that. And so far, at least, the administration has indicated it's going to be a part of what they believe to be kind of the next steps necessary to decarbonize electricity. But at the same time, you have other groups. So the NGOs, some I would say in the environmental community, would argue that it's just not part of what needs to happen, and that we can do it all on batteries, solar, and wind. And so you're going to continue to face a challenge from that neck of the woods, even if you don't face it inside the current administration.
That's where that word realism comes in. I mean, you've got to be pragmatic, practical about this at some point. I mean, you look at, say, the MISO grid right now. On its best days, wind is supplying about 25% of the electricity. And, how do you replace that other 75, which is predominantly coal and natural gas?
Right.
One other element of the financing that I wanted to ask you about, I know you and Stacy and others at Minnkota pay attention to what's going on in Bismarck at the Capitol right now. And there's a lot of talk about this legacy fund that we have, which is now approaching a balance of $8 billion. There's talk about investing some of that in North Dakota. That could potentially provide one component of your financing, maybe.
It could, and we are having a conversation with a number of folks in Bismarck right now about exactly that thought. And if you go back, and Jeff, you've been part of this a long time, and clearly understand the legacy fund, what its purpose, and it was never really, it was designed to put together a set of funds that would build that you could reinvest back in North Dakota.
Mhm.
You know, we all tend to kind of do this though. So you build up the fund and then you go, now I don't really want to spend it because I have it, right? We all do that in our own lives as well. And so, but I think you're right. I look at it in terms of saying, if you really want to effectively use the legacy fund, then allow it to go back into investments that will produce something else, or allow for, in this case, allow for an industry to get better positioned to live in a carbon managed world, to allow us to produce a product that can make us more efficiently remove oil and gas, for example, from the west side of the state. So you end up in a position that you're using those funds to reinvest in actually something that has a chance to give you a return back, or to preserve jobs, or to add jobs, or to do other things. I mean, I'm not going to suggest that we don't invest in roads and bridges out of the legacy fund. But roads and bridges don't return anything back to, they create jobs once to build, and they're there so you have safe roads, but they don't keep returning. There's nothing that comes back off of that. So part of our argument has been, if you're going to use the legacy fund, then use it for things like this, which give you a chance to say, we can produce a product using in this case, the coal within the state, which has been a staple here for ever, decades at least, even further back than that, but has been a staple that allows you to produce a product that is carbon managed and lives in the world that people want to achieve today as it relates to emissions into the atmosphere, produces jobs, and then gives you a better chance to actually produce a greener oil and gas. I describe this to people at times. They're like, well, why would we want to do that? Okay, so and I'll use the EOR side of it, even though right now we're only talking about putting it in the ground for permanent storage. So there's a big debate. So do you put more drilling in the Arctic Wildlife National Refuge? Nobody wants to go to Florida and see a platform in the Gulf or on the outside of it. So as you think about the ability, you have a hole in the ground already. You have the ability to get more out of it. Most people don't come to North Dakota to ever see it. So the idea that you could have a more productive set of fields in North Dakota without drilling off of coasts or in places that none of us want to go and look at another oil derrick off the Florida Keys, right? So if you can figure out how to do this better, can do it more efficiently, you're in a much better spot. So can North Dakota figure out, how do we take some of the funds out of the legacy and actually advance those things? Now, the challenge with that is nobody really knows exactly how all of this works. So it suddenly becomes this set of risk profile that you might have some missteps. And then everybody points to the missteps rather than what you were trying to advance. So our argument, Jeff, is exactly what you're describing. If North Dakota wants to figure out how to help advance what are at least two of the main staples of the economy, at least on the western side of the state for sure, you want to figure out how to get more green. You want to figure out how to take an emission that we have today and turn it into something that has value. And recognize, though, that you're talking about $1 billion project that folks like us who have 150,000 members will never be able to afford on our own without some help. Yep. Right? It'd be irresponsible for me to go say, let's put $1 billion on the balance sheet of 150,000 people on the east side of the state when the benefits are global in nature, if you want to think about it that way.
Well, you most certainly have a lot of support in the state legislature, at least. I think you can count on that. There's one other bit of legislation, House Bill 1452 is out there to create a clean, sustainable energy authority and a clean, sustainable energy fund. And projects like Project Tundra, that's exactly what they're looking at. North Dakota's on the cutting edge of some of this new energy technology and really a leader in the world. And Minnkota's part of that.
Yeah. So that part of it is exciting, scares the living tar out of you if you're me, right? How do you figure out how to do that? And that's what I think that's been maybe one of our bigger challenges, Jeff. And lately, even in North Dakota, I mean, as you well know, I mean, worked on legislature and with those guys a long time, is someone like us shows up and says, hey, we need you to help us to the tune of hundreds of millions on a project. And they look at it and say, well, why do you need the state help to do so? But when you start digging through it and fundamentally understand that what you're doing is talking about a gigantic project that has lots of benefits, if you will, if you're successful, but is no individual can take on their own, right? So it is a classic example in my mind of a place where if what you want to do to advance certain policy measures, if what you want to do is to advance certain economical conditions, if what you want to do is help try to figure out how to put technology on that can help save an industry, no one person is going to take that on their own, unless you have a balance sheet that is allows you to have enough play money that $1 billion doesn't matter. Well, we don't have very many companies in North Dakota that do that.
Mhm.
So
You've encapsulated it pretty well there, I think, Mac. It's the future's exciting, but it's a little bit terrifying too, right?
oh, absolutely, absolutely. It's I look at it from this perspective. I think we have, if people are willing to kind of recognize the opportunity in front of us, that we have in North Dakota a significant chance to meet the needs for those who this is all about. We have to figure out how to improve the environment. I think we have an absolute opportunity to do that. And back to my argument of, look, if you want to produce fossil fuel now, if what you believe is we can operate in a world in the future with no fossil fuels, then don't support any portion of this, right? But I've yet to figure out how you're going to fly an airplane on something that doesn't have BTUs in it. Right now, part of the argument is we can do it with biomass, we can do it with, but somewhere the ability to produce that needs energy as well, right? So, so the concept that we can go at least near term, maybe there's a Jetsons-based world out there somewhere that we can ultimately make all of this work without fossil-based fuels. Not within a horizon I can see personally, but maybe there is one. Is we have to then figure out how to make fossil fuels a better product, and then you have to figure out transition strategies to be able to do that, and how to more efficiently use what we have. And if you can get comfortable with that concept, then what we're doing in Tundra is a really nice bridge to be able to help you through being able to do those things. And but you have to accept that, to your point earlier, that there's some fossil basis for a period of time that from a realism perspective, that's going to be a part of what you do, right? And even if you look at what people are doing right now as it relates to transitions in 2035 or in 2040 or whatever, and you look at Tundra, I mean, right now, Tundra is start in 2025, tax credit runs for 12 years. You have a project that technically could be done in 2037. And you get 300 megawatts of carbon-free electricity for a decade or 12 years.
Yeah.
And if you're honest and say, well, what we're trying to do is get to carbon-free, I'm giving you a carbon-free product.
Yeah.
Right? Meets the definition of what you're asking for. It just happens to come from a fuel source that you don't like. So
Yeah. So really, for the right person, it's going to be an amazing opportunity.
You asked Kate at the outset, I mean, who kind of who would invest in these things? So somebody who's trying to figure out, how do I reduce my carbon footprint, right, to meet my ESG goals or to meet my sustainability goals or otherwise. And if you look at it on a volumetric basis, if you can, in a project, remove 4 million tons a year against what some of your alternatives are, you have a really good opportunity from a volumetric perspective to get a bunch of CO2 out of the atmosphere, right? And then you have a chance to say, how do I refine the technology and continue to use it for additional purposes as you go forward, right? So that's one of the other, why would somebody do this from an investment perspective? And why is there a 45Q? Why are we incentivizing this via tax credit,
Yeah.
right? It's because you have to advance the technology. It's no different than the wind tax credit that's been in place for decades, or solar tax credit, or storage tax credit. Is there was a desire by policymakers in this country and arguably the public to advance technologies, and that's what you're doing here, right? You're figuring out, how do you incentivize somebody to take risks?
Mm-hmm. Yeah.
So
looking, for forward to the next, 5 years, let's say, what's that horizon look like for Minnkota and specifically, Project Tundra?
yeah, so 5 years. So I would say by the end of this year, we're going to be in a position to know whether or not Tundra will move forward.
Yep.
The engineering work will be completed. Storage facility work will be completed. We'll know whether or not I think that people are willing to take a risk from a tax equity investment perspective, the alignment of where is a new administration in terms of support from it, from the Department of Energy and IRS and all the agencies, that APA that we have to interface with. So by the end of this year, we are anticipating or expecting we'll make a decision with respect to move Tundra forward. If it moves forward, we can make it all work in 5 years. To your question, Kate, you'd be in your first or second year of operation then at that point, right? So you have about a 3-year construction period. So take about another year to get all of the details together and through the permit process and so on, and then a 3-year construction period. So you'd be about year one into Tundra operating 5 years from now. If it doesn't move forward and we continue to put pressure being described now on CO2, and we continue to have a marketplace that is messed up because of what I'll call subsidization of resources in the current marketplace, I think you'll have a really hard time in North Dakota seeing plants continue to operate, period. Right? That there will be pressure on all of us in such a way that you'll either have, and I think this is one of the challenges people need to recognize historically for us, and Jeff knows this as utilities, you've always worried about the environmental side, kind of what was happening in terms of next environmental regs and so on. So if you think about moving ahead now, you have pressure potentially coming into administration on the environmental side, but you also have these economic pressures on the facilities as well. You can probably live through one or the other, but it becomes really difficult to live through both. And so I think if we don't find solutions and we continue to have a set of conditions that we are living through today, you're going to just continue to find 5 years from now, you're going to see more plants in North Dakota under pressure from an operating perspective, and whether it's even defendable to continue to operate, right? For those in North Dakota, I mean, everyone talking about today as it relates to what happened to Coal Creek, largest facility in the state of North Dakota, and everyone had a slightly different opinion around, and GRE made their decisions based on whatever set of criteria they were looking at. But there is an element to their story about the economics that we're all facing. Yeah. Every utility in the state of North Dakota now facing some economic challenges associated with your assets as we go forward. And so that I think is part of the I hope recognition in Bismarck and the recognition in other places is that if we don't find some solutions here and we don't produce a product that's more accepted in Minnesota or more accepted in South Dakota or more accepted in Iowa in our region or more accepted globally around the world, we're going to see continued pressures that we as utilities won't be able to defend our assets. Not because anybody wants to close them, you just won't. I put my economic hat on and put my responsible business person hat on and say, I have a hard time defending continuing to operate it if you're at losses.
Yeah.
What you're telling us is it's pretty important to make Project Tundra work, Mac.
Yeah, true.
Like that's what it
Very
comes
true.
down to.
And Jeff, it's not necessarily, and you know this, right? It's not necessarily because we want to see our project go forward. It's really because people need to fundamentally understand that it is a component to having lignite-based generation continue to operate in a carbon management. Yeah, left unchecked, and I don't know that most people understand this necessarily either, is lignite, because of the nature of it's a low BTU fuel to start with, is already penalized from a carbon perspective to begin with against its alternatives, right? It's already at a deficit because of its BTU nature than, say, a Powder River Basin coal in Wyoming, and certainly a higher BTU coal burned in other parts of this country. And so you already started a deficit here with respect to your CO2 footprint. So you're going to be under more pressure as you look at carbon-based policy measures here to begin with. So you're going to need to recognize that if you're a policymaker in this state or in other places as well around the country. So.
Yeah, very interesting. So just if our viewers want to learn more about Project Tundra, Mac, where do they go to do that?
Yeah, now you're going to test. I think it's www.projecttundra.com.
Yeah, I believe Stacy had mentioned that when we interviewed her last season. So
right.
That's
so
good.
You can find out all about it there. It'll give you all the basics. It'll give you animation of what we're trying to accomplish. What we're doing isn't completely novel. Obviously, they've done. We've demonstrated at Petronova that you can do it. One of the differences, maybe make a comment on this, people point to Petronova as not being successful, and you got to go back and remember Petronova was again designed on the idea that the revenues generated were from the additional uplift of the oil that came out. So the technology works. They produce CO2, they send it down, they produce more oil.
Yep.
It's just that when your economics are based on $60 oil and you have $40 or $50 oil, you have a difficult time, right? So it's not that, everyone says, well, Petronova didn't work. That's not true. Petronova worked exactly how it was described, but it also was described on a set of economics that don't exist at the moment. And so oil moves back up again. You'll see Petronova get turned back on again, right? And so it's not a technology issue. I mean, the engineers will figure out and the scientists will figure out. I am 100% confident that the geology in North Dakota from a long-term permanent storage facility will work, right? So, I mean, that's one of the things that I think we need to get people comfortable with. The reason we have oil and gas and the Bakken like we do is because we've been able to trap and store gas and oil in caverns below the ground for millennia. And what you're talking about is putting stuff back in those caverns, right? Hasn't leaked since the history of time in general, and you're putting stuff back in it. So I'm 100% confident we'll figure the technology part out. I'm very confident we'll figure out how do you permanently store it in the ground. I think it's whether or not people want to take a risk to say, let's put a technology in that. And if you wanted to be a skeptic, you have some who say we don't want it to be successful because it means fundamentally we can continue to produce a product from coal, and we just don't want to see that happen, right? There is a contingent in the world that just says we don't want you to be successful because it means you're going to continue to produce a product from something we don't like.
Yeah. So just on that one follow-up question. So what would be the kind of the economic impact if like a plant the size of Young Station were to retrofit that CO2? I mean, when you talk about that, what does that look like?
From an economics perspective or a cost perspective?
Cost perspective, yeah.
Yeah, so it's about somewhere between $1 billion and $1.3 billion is the current estimate, right?
Yeah.
Now, so go back to my 4 million tons a year, $200 million plus or minus, not quite that, but again, we can all do math. So 200 million multiply that by 12 years, right? You end up with a number in the $2.4 billion tax range.
Right.
And so ultimately the economic, now you got to operate the facility too, right? And that's about, call it 700 million-ish or so across that time frame to operate, 800 million to operate during that 12-year period. So if I take 1.1 billion plus 800 million, I get 2 billion, and I produce $2.4 billion in tax credits. And somewhere in there is a return, in addition to paying for all the debt, as well as paying for all the operating costs for 12 years. So, I mean, now, sounds really simple and it's really big numbers. You just do the math and they add up, but it's obviously a little bit more complicated than that. There's a lot of other pieces to it, but people ask, well, why would you do it? And in its simplest form, just multiply 200 million times 12.
Yeah.
And you get $2.4 billion in tax credits off of a project that costs you $1 billion to build and $800 million to operate for 12 years.
Yeah. Yeah. It's a no-brainer.
So
Sounds like you're in the black to me, Mac.
yeah, as long as everybody doesn't need their 20% risk premium on every single thing you do, then they eat up quickly the anything you might have left over. So
yeah, well, we'll be pulling for you.
Yeah.
Definitely watching this.
So
yeah, absolutely.
it is exciting and to your point, Jeff, terrifying. And part of it really though is, and this is what you have to get, I think, policymakers to understand. Unless you are a really huge company, there you can't take this on without help. I mean, that's what 45Q is about. It's incentives that the state of North Dakota has already put in place. It's if you really want to see this advance and you want to be in a position that you ultimately can get a carbon-free product out of coal, then you got to figure out how societally people help pay for that. Because one individual company is not going to do it all.
Yeah. Yeah.
So.
Well, Mac, thanks so much. I appreciate all the time and the questions that you answered for us. It's always great to learn more about Project Tundra and kind of what that's looking like here in our future. So we appreciate you being a part of it.
Sure. Yeah. Let's all hope in the course of the next 9 months or so, we can make each of those technological pieces and the policy pieces and the kind of acceptance of it all come together and then figure out somebody to help fund it. So.
Absolutely. And hopefully interviewing you on season 4, we'll be talking about the next greatest phase here with Project Tundra.
Right. I hope that's the case. So.
Thanks for joining.
You guys have a good day.
Yep.
You guys, good to see you, Jeff.
You bet, Mac. Take care.
Talk to you later.
Thank you for listening to another episode of Mind, America's Lignite Energy Podcast. For more information on lignite energy in North Dakota, visit lignite.com.